Welcome to 20th Century Music and Arts. This is going to be our last episode in our series on the evolution of distortion and other aspects of this heaviness in rock music during the 1960s. Now in this episode we're solely going to look at the last year of the decade, 1969. Jimmy Page would continue to lead the Yardbirds and went on a tour of the United States in early 1968. Page had really developed his use of feedback and distortion, and he actually started experimenting with playing the electric guitar with a violin bow to create eerie, sustained sounds. Now, it should be noted that the band Creation had been doing similar experiments 2 years earlier. Now, this technique was used in their cover of a song called Dazed and Confused by a singer called Jake Holmes, who released an album called The Above Ground Sound of Jake Holmes in 1967. Now, the Yardbirds did some recording while they were in America, but these recordings were shelved, and by July the band had decided to call it quits. Page wanted to continue in the more heavy blues rock direction, while Keith Relf and drummer Jim McCarty wanted to play folk and classical music. But Page ended up having the rights to the name, so he formed a new lineup of the Yardbirds. Initially, bassist Chris Dredja was on board, but he soon left to pursue a career in photographing rock bands. Singer Terry Reid declined to join the band, but he recommended his friend Robert Plant, who in turn recommended the drummer John Bonham. Both Plant and Bonham were only 20, and they were from the city of Birmingham. John Paul Jones, who had played together with Page on numerous sessions tracks, asked to become the bassist. They started out as the New Yardbirds, but would soon change their name to Led Zeppelin. While playing a variety of styles of music right from the start, a foundational component of the sound was the raunchy, menacing blues rock, full of distorted riffs, thunderous drums, and wailing banshee vocals. This sound was now the definite blueprint for heavy metal. After heading into the studio in September and October of 1968, their self-titled debut was released in January of 1969. This album was a complete game changer. Hard rock and heavy metal is right here. This is the blueprint for all of it. And what's great about it is there's a certain darkness in the sound on the album. This is like the blues on steroids. Now, distortion is found throughout the album. Yes, there are acoustic numbers, but there is that heavy distorted blues sound. Now, the album starts out with the great rocker Good Times, Bad Times, and Page, he does this like machine gun rapid guitar solo right in the middle. It's amazing. And there are two incredible blues covers of Willie Dixon songs, I Can't Quit You Babe and You Shook Me, which Jeff Beck had actually covered with his own group a year before. Page shows himself as one of the guitar giants with these blues leads that would be matched by Robert Plant's belted screams. It's like this amazing call and response. Now there's the proto-punk ferocity of Communication Breakdown, which is actually based on the Eddie Cochran's song Nervous Breakdown. But for me, there are two tracks that are just beyond incredible: Dazed and Confused and How Many More Times. Dazed and Confused was a reworking of the James Holmes song with new lyrics, but he did keep the exact same bass line. Now, Page creates a riff that would define the heaviness of heavy metal. I mean, there's no way this song does not influence Black Sabbath's music. And again, in the middle, he's creating these eerie sounds with the violin or cello bowl. And then he comes up with this guitar lead that is just like complete cacophony. It's absolutely amazing. And How Many More Times is a lot like this too. And that was actually referencing the Howling Wolf song, How Many More Years. And it's got this incredible build up at the beginning, and then this powerful riff kicks in. It is just awesome. While the distorted guitar of Page is all throughout the track, you've got the powerful vocals of Plant. And one thing that needs to be noted is that John Bonham is like the heaviest rock drummer ever heard. It is so thick and so powerful. I mean, this album, it's heavy blues in a way that was not heard before. And you know what? In October of that year, they would release an even heavier album. Released in October 1969, Led Zeppelin II brings the riff. That's all I gotta say. It brings the riff. You got these tracks like the Lemon Song, Heartbreaker, Living Loving Maid, Bring It On Home, What Is and What Should Never Be. They have these great distorted blues guitar riffs. And the sounds, heaviness was attributed to maybe Page switching from playing the Fender Telecaster, which he did on the first album, to playing a Gibson Les Paul. There's this incredible drum solo bass piece called Moby Dick, but the most unbelievable track is Whole Lotta Love. The riff and the guitar lead on this track are two of the most awe-inspiring moments in rock. You know, I like this song so much that when I was walking by my friend's house and his sister, this was when CDs had just come out, and his sister had a copy of the CD, I kind of knocked on his door and said, "Can I hear Whole Lotta Love?" I know. Led Zeppelin ushered in the era of hard rock and heavy metal in the 70s. Absolutely, with these two albums. Now, the state of Michigan would produce a number of artists that would bring serious distorted guitar sound into the music, and several of them would release albums in 1969. Now, out of Flint came a band that really turned up the volume, Grand Funk Railroad. This trio took the influence and grooves of like the R&B and soul and combined it with just some serious high amplification rock. At times they were known as the loudest band, and in those years of 1969, 1970, 1971, they would sell a whole lot of albums and a whole lot of tickets. Their debut album, On Time, was released in August 1969. This album, again, great start to finish. Standout tracks include Are You Ready?, Time Machine, TNUC, won't explain what that is, Into the Sun, and Heartbreaker, which actually came out earlier than the Led Zeppelin song of the same name. Their self-titled sophomore album, which became sort of known as the Red Album, would be released on December 29th, 1969. This album is just as good. It's got great tracks like Get This Thing on the Move, Please Don't Worry, Mr. Limousine Driver, and they have a fantastic cover of the Animals' Inside Looking Out. But then there is the track Paranoid. Now, no, not the Black Sabbath song or album, but I'm pretty sure that this song influenced both of those things. The track Paranoid by Grand Funk Railroad has some of the most amazing fuzz and volume. Everything's amplified, the bass and the guitar, but with no distortion pedal. It's like just pure amp distortion. Now, while the band, they were heavy and all three instruments were given a lot of emphasis, they never lose their groove to their sound. They've always got that, they got the funk that's in the Grand Funk Railroad name. Now, both these albums were massive sellers, and by 1970, Grand Funk Railroad was the biggest band in America, and they actually sold out Shea Stadium faster than the Beatles had. Please check out those two albums from 1969. MC5 came together in the mid-1960s in Lincoln Park, Michigan, and started becoming involved in Detroit's music scene. The name was short for Motor City 5, and the band took, fierce garage rock, and they combined it with some serious radical left-wing politics. The two guitar players, Wayne Kramer and Fred Sonic Smith, took the influence of jazz saxophonists like Albert Ayler, Archie Shepp, John Coltrane, and Pharoah Sanders, and they actually tried to replicate these sounds on their guitars. They even covered Pharoah Sanders' Upper and Lower Egypt, and they also opened for the jazz artist Sun Ra. But they were also inspired by, Hendrix, The Who, The Stones. They play a real fierce rock and roll as well. Now, they were definitely a direct inspiration to punk bands in the next decade. Some people have argued they invented punk rock. In fact, their debut album was a live album, released in 1969, called Kick Out the Jams. This album is straight up fierce, and it's relentless in its intensity, and it's got this amazing twin guitar attack. There's so many great tracks in the album: Rambling Rose, Rocket Reducer, Number 62, Motor City is Burning, I Want You Right Now, and Starship, which is like a tripped out tune. It's kind of inspired by Sun Ra, but the title track with its profanity, its call to arms, is the one that people really know. Now, yeah, pretty good. Yes, I could get crazy. MC5 had a heaviness on this album that I say they would never be able to replicate in the studio with their further albums. And again, it could be argued that MC5 invented punk rock. But you know what? Maybe it was another band from Michigan. Maybe it was the Stooges. Formed in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1967. They were originally known as the Psychedelic Stooges. Like the MC5, they took inspiration from garage rock, the Stones, but they're taking a lot of inspiration from the Doors, the Velvet Underground, free jazz, and, even experimental composers like Harry Partch. While the band played with the same intensity as MC5, they were less political and they're more like nihilistic and confrontational. Frontman Iggy Pop, or Iggy Stooge as he was sometimes known as, would do these hyperactive dances on stage. He would jump into the audience. He'd smear himself in peanut butter. He'd even cut himself with glass. He did the most insane things. And the guitarist Ron Asheton, he brings this intense fuzz and heaviness, great use of wah-wah. It's really, really great sound here. When they went to record their debut in 1969, and that was actually produced by John Cale of the Velvet Underground, they did not have enough material, so they actually wrote a bunch of songs in the studio as well. Simply called The Stooges and released in August 1969, the album is again fierce, proto-punk, amazing songs like 1969, I Want to Be Your Dog, No Fun. They do this dark droning track called We Will Fall, where Cale played the viola on it like he had done in the Velvet Underground. This album is incredible and is another game changer in rock, and will be massively influential on bands in New York and, all the UK punk scene, everything that would kind of happen with punk in the 70s. Now their follow-up album is even better in 1970, but hey, I got a whole video on that one. Go watch that. But Michigan had a lot of other good bands releasing music in 1969. The band SRC released a great psychedelic rocking album called Milestones. The Frost released an album called Frost Music, and Frigid Pink released their cover of House of the Rising Sun with a whole lot of distortion. Great stuff. Now, Detroit native Vincent Ferner, better known as Alice Cooper, he released the debut album as Alice Cooper, and Alice Cooper again was both a person and a band. Now, it doesn't sound like the Alice Cooper that most people know, but Praise for You. It's this weird, great psychedelic experimental album, very much in line with kind of like Frank Zappa. It is strange, but it really has some cool distorted guitar moments, and go check that album out. But you know what? For 1969, let's go over to the UK and look at the heavy blues rock that was going on there. Now, the Jeff Beck Group put out their second album, Beck Ola. Amazing stuff. Jeff continues to use his distortion and feedback on tracks like Spanish Boots, Hangman's Knees, Rice Pudding, really good track, and does two great Elvis covers, All Shook Up and Jailhouse Rock. Humble Pie, they released their debut album, As Safe as Yesterday, featuring the powerful vocals of Steve Marriott and of course the excellent guitar work of Peter Frampton. Great heavy blues rock. And then the band Free would also release their debut album, Ton of Sobs. Again, that great blues rock. Now, after the breakup of Cream, Eric Clapton and Ginger Baker would join Rick Grech and Steve Winwood to form Blind Faith, and they released their Soul album in 1969. Not super heavy, but there's some really great jams on that one. Then we got Mott the Hoople. They released their debut album, which has some pretty cool rockers on it, including a cover of The Kinks' You Really Got Me. Now, out of Ireland, the power trio Taste, they would release their debut album featuring the unbelievable guitar playing of Rory Gallagher. Just incredible stuff. And of course, 1969 was the year that the Groundhogs released Blues Obituary. Please check out my video on the Groundhogs if you haven't already. But over in the United States, there was a lot of that great blues rock happening too. The James Gang released their debut called Year album in 1969, which was, experimental but had some great guitar courtesy of Joe Walsh. Guitarist Leslie West, he released this amazing, powerful, relentless blues rock album called Mountain. Now, he would actually form a band using the same name the next year. And of course, the Allman Brothers would release their great debut in 1969. And that would be featuring the team of Dwayne Allman and Dickie Betts on guitar. Now, this is really the start of the Southern rock sound, and it gave the world the first exposure to the almighty track Whipping Post. Though this is the studio version, you really got to hear the live versions to do that track justice. But you know what? Let's look at rarer tracks and albums from 1969. In the US, there was this band called the Firebirds who released an awesome album called Light My Fire, which not only has that cover by the Doors, but has some really searing and evil sounding fuzz. on the album. It's great. I discovered this band called The 13 Flavors, and they released an album called Hair, which was the cover of that song. But there's all these other tracks on the album that are so unbelievably heavy. Like, some of it's almost like Black Sabbath in terms of its distortion level. You know, it's just fantastic stuff. And there's this incredible track I found by a band called Summit. I think it's just called Darkness. And again, this incredible fuzzy acid rock guitar. Another great release is this kind of raw, garagey acid rock album called Dragonfly. That's the name of the band in the album. It was released that year. And there's another really great, unique sounding band called Morgan. That's Morgen. And they released their solo album that year. It's almost Doors-like, dark theme. It's very unique sounding.
Come take a bite of my gingerbread house and let your troubles fade away.
And then I found this rare sounding, it's almost like a proto-punk track called Piece of Your Love by a group called Blues Climax. It's really quite fast. Now, of course, you can't forget about Caledonia by the experimental group Cro-Magnon. Now, this isn't really rock. It's something just completely weird, but there's this like proto-black death metal vocal. You know what? Check out my series on the most wild and experimental 60s rocks, where I talk about Cro-Magnon and other bands. And then there is the debut album by Coven. Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. While not that heavy in sound, it was the first album with overtly satanic themes, and they have a song called Black Sabbath. I cover this band in more detail on my first episode of my Black Sabbath series. You know what, let's go over to the UK, and one great track that needs to be checked out is Magic Potion by the band called The Open Mind. Really great heavy sound there. Then there's the album Wassa Wassa by the Edgar Broughton Band. You know, searing raw psychedelic blues with gruff Captain Beefheart-esque vocals. I need to do a series or an episode on these guys. Then there's High Tide. Now, this band would release one album in 1969 called Sea Shanties, and it's a unique, dark-sounding band that uses this electric, distorted violins. You get these sustained, distorted notes. It's so unique. I really got to check the album out. It's kind of almost Doorsy in vocals, but very, very heavy. Now, there's another great psychedelic album which has its moments. It's called If Only for a Moment, and it's by a band called the Blossom Toes. And then there's a band called the Little Free Rock, and they released a self-titled album in 1969. Again, it's this great fuzzy blues rock. And of course, there's the prog thing sort of happening, and a great kind of proto-prog album that has some great guitar work is the self-titled album by Andromeda. But you know what? There's big names, or at least more well-known names, releasing heavy tracks in 1969. You know, speaking of prog rock, we got to talk about the opening track on King Crimson's debut in the Court of the Crimson King, the track 21st Century Schizoid Man. That's a serious heavy track. It's got distorted vocals and these intense, complex, dynamic guitar work. It's like math rock. And then you've got Pink Floyd. They're starting to gain a following by 1969, and they actually created a straight-ahead hard-rocking track called The Nile Song that appeared on the soundtrack for the movie More. And on their album Umaguma, David Gilmour composed a sort of three-part song called The Narrow Way. Part 2 of this piece, you know, it has one of the most sinister-sounding guitar riffs I've ever heard. It's so unique. And, you know, Deep Purple, they would release their third self-titled album. It'd be their last one with Rod Evans. And it's got, again, great searing guitar work by Ritchie Blackmore on tracks like Chasing Shadows, The Painter, Fault Line, Bird Has Flown, and Why Didn't Rosemary Take the Pill? Yeah. But the biggest band in the world, the Beatles, they would release an almost proto-doom metal song on their album Abbey Road. I Want You, She's So Heavy. It's dark, plodding, low-end, distorted song. It's great. It's just one of my favorites by the band. Now, as a Canadian, I cannot skip the Neil Young and Crazy Horse album that was released in 1969, Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. Now, throughout the album, Young plays with this incredible fuzzy distortion that's grunge long before grunge. This is heard on, Cinnamon Girl, the title track, Down by the River, and Cowgirl in the Sand. I absolutely love this album. Now, I want to mention a couple more releases that year that are a bit more experimental, but definitely have a heavy edge to them. Captain Beefheart and his band would release the album Trout Mask Replica that year. I'm talking dissonant, disjointed, off time. This might be one of the most difficult albums to listen to in the history of rock music. But there's a lot of heavy guitar work on it, especially on the track Moonlight on Vermont. Now, Beefheart also guests on the Frank Zappa album Hot Rats, which was a real pioneer album in the world of jazz fusion. The song he's on, Willie the Pimp, has not only Beefheart's gravelly vocals, but it has some searing lead guitar work by Frank Zappa that is just absolutely incredible. And though, Hendrix did not release an album in 1969, he did do a great performance at Woodstock, doing a rendition of the Star Spangled Banner. Just absolutely incredible stuff. Actually, you know what? At Woodstock, there was a lot of great distorted guitar rock happening. I mean, 10 years after playing I'm Going Home, Santana, Soul Sacrifice, and of course The Who, doing a track like Summertime Blues. Distortion was really everywhere in 1969. Now, looking back, you can see the change in the distorted guitar sound was absolutely massive in the 60s. I mean, at the beginning, we go from recording mistakes in country music tracks to proto-metal sounds by the end of the decade. There would not be a decade where the sound and the culture would change so much as the 1960s. And a big part of that was the introduction of the distorted guitar. Thank you for watching 20th Century Music and Arts. Please like, share, subscribe, and comment. And let me know what your favorite song from 1969 is. Thank you.